If you're in your 40s or 50s, at 75, I want to share some lessons from my journey. As the wheels of my car hummed along the winding country road, I couldn't help but feel the weight of time pressing on my shoulders. Beside me, Tobby, my loyal German shepherd, rested with his head perched on the window's edge, his ears twitching slightly at the distant rustle of trees, the simplicity of this moment. The quiet companionship was a stark contrast to the life I had once lived, a life built on wealth, ambition, and a hunger for success. Back then, I was a millionaire, the kind of man who commanded attention simply by stepping into a room. I lived in a sprawling mansion perched atop a hill, with marble floors that gleamed under the chandelier's glow. My driveway boasted a fleet of luxury cars, each more extravagant than the last. Sleek sports cars, imposing SUVs, and a classic convertible that turned heads wherever I went. Every morning, I would select a watch from my collection, each piece a masterpiece of craftsmanship and a statement of my success. The weight of those watches felt different on my wrist back then, a badge of honor, a declaration of achievement. My days were a blur of high-stakes meetings and lavish dinners. The restaurants I frequented were the kind where the menu didn't list prices, and the waiters knew your name before you even walked through the door. I traveled the world on private jets, waking up in one country and falling asleep in another, each trip more extravagant than the last. I can still remember the first time I stayed in a suite that overlooked the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean. The infinity pool seemed to blend seamlessly with the ocean, and the air was filled with the scent of salt and sun-warmed citrus. It was breathtaking, yet even then, I felt a strange emptiness gnawing at the edges of my mind. You see, luxury has a way of consuming you. The more you have, the more you crave, and before you know it, you're running on a treadmill with no end in sight. My obsession with money and status was insatiable, and I poured every ounce of energy into climbing higher, achieving more, and proving myself to a world that likely wasn't paying attention. My wife, bless her heart, tried to keep up. She was there for every party, every gala, every high-profile event where we smiled for cameras and exchanged polite laughter with strangers. But even as we stood shoulder to shoulder, I could feel the distance growing between us. "I miss you," she once whispered during a rare quiet moment at home. I was skimming through emails on my phone, distracted, barely hearing her. Looking back now, I realize how many cries for attention I ignored. How many opportunities I squandered to nurture the relationships that truly mattered. At that time, my focus was singular: productivity. Every moment of my day was accounted for, optimized for maximum efficiency. I followed strict routines, believing that discipline was the key to maintaining my empire. My habits were precise: wake up at dawn, work out in my state-of-the-art home gym, devour a breakfast designed by a personal nutritionist, and dive straight into the demands of the day. But even as I achieved goal after goal, the satisfaction was fleeting. Each milestone I reached became another stepping stone to something greater, something more elusive. I began to wonder if the concept of happiness itself was a mirage, an illusion dangling just out of reach. As I drove now, with the sun dipping lower on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I couldn't help but reflect on the cost of that life. I had been surrounded by richness, but I was never truly rich. My relationships with my wife, my daughter, even my closest friends had suffered. I thought I was building a legacy, but in truth, I was merely collecting trophies. Tobby stirred beside me, nudging my arm with his nose. His quiet presence grounded me, reminding me of how far I had come from the man I used to be. I reached over to scratch behind his ears, his soft fur comforting beneath my fingers. "Good boy," I murmured. The simplicity of this moment felt more fulfilling than all the champagne toasts and luxury vacations I had once reveled in. It had taken me decades to understand that the true value of life isn't measured by the weight of your wallet, but by the strength of your connections and the clarity of your conscience. I thought of my wife again, the look in her eyes the night she left. It wasn't anger or bitterness. It was disappointment. "You're chasing ghosts," she had said softly before closing the door behind her. At the time, I didn't understand, but now I realized she was right. I had been chasing a version of success that left no room for joy, no space for love. The car hit a small bump, jolting me back to the present. The road ahead was smooth and familiar, leading me home. A modest house awaited me at the end of this journey. Nothing like the opulence I once lived in, but it was filled with something far more precious. Peace, Tobby barked softly. As if sensing my thoughts, I smiled, glancing at him. We've come a long way, haven't we? As we turned onto the gravel driveway, the setting sun bathed the house in golden light. I parked the car and stepped out, the cool evening air wrapping around me like an old friend. This was my life now, simple, quiet, and deeply meaningful. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly living. It's strange how betrayal sneaks up on you. It doesn't announce itself or give you time to prepare. It strikes quietly, like a shadow slipping through a crack in the door until it stands before you. Undeniable and monstrous. For me, betrayal came wearing the face of Robert, my best friend of 30 years. I remember the day I discovered the truth as vividly as if it happened yesterday. I had just returned home from the hospital, recovering from a mild heart attack that should have been my wake-up call. But instead of rest, I found myself seated at my desk, sifting through financial records that had arrived in an unmarked envelope. At first, the numbers didn't make sense. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Subtle discrepancies in balances. Nothing glaring, but enough to make me pause. I dug deeper, the pit in my stomach growing with every page I turned. When I finally saw Robert's name tied to the offshore accounts, my chest tightened, and not from my heart condition. Robert, the man who had stood beside me during every triumph and failure. We had built my empire together, brick by brick. He was there for every late-night brainstorming session, every celebration, every tough call. He was more than a friend. He was family. And now, staring at the undeniable evidence of his theft, I felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath me. I confronted him 2 days later. I remember every detail of that encounter, the sterile light of his office, the faint scent of cologne that always lingered on his tailored suits. I slammed the folder of documents onto his desk, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Why?" I demanded, my throat dry and tight. "Why would you do this to me?" Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression infuriatingly calm. He didn't deny it. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. A cold, calculated smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Because I could," he said simply. Those 3 words shattered whatever was left of my heart. It wasn't just the money he had taken. It was the trust, the bond, the years of loyalty I thought we shared. He had seen my blind spots, my vulnerabilities, and exploited them without hesitation. I left his office in a daze, the weight of his betrayal pressing on my chest like a physical force. The walk to my car felt endless, and by the time I slid into the driver's seat, my hands were trembling for the first time in years. I cried, not out of weakness but out of the overwhelming pain of losing both a fortune and a friend. In the weeks that followed, my life became a blur of legal battles and sleepless nights. My lawyer told me that recovering even a fraction of what Robert had stolen would be a miracle. The courts moved slowly, and with each delay, my anger simmered, threatening to consume me. But beneath the anger, there was something else. Shame. How had I been so blind, so trusting? I replayed our years of friendship in my mind, searching for the signs I had missed, the moments where his intentions might have slipped through the cracks. But all I could see were the times I had leaned on him, the moments he had been my rock. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I realized something important. My obsession with success had blinded me, not only to Robert's betrayal but to the warning signs all around me. I had been so focused on growing my wealth, chasing goals, and maintaining my image that I had ignored the cracks in my foundation. Robert wasn't the only one who had betrayed me. In many ways, I had betrayed myself. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly, the sharp edges of my anger began to dull. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward understanding. I realized that holding on to my hatred for Robert would only weigh me down further. He had taken enough from me already. I wouldn't let him take my peace as well. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about excusing his actions. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment. It was about reclaiming the energy I had wasted on anger and using it to rebuild. As I sit here now, looking back on those days, I can see how Robert's betrayal, as painful as it was, became a turning point. It forced me to confront truths I had avoided for too long. It made me reevaluate my values, my choices, and the life I wanted to live moving forward. Trust, I've learned, is a fragile thing. It takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. And while I'll never trust Robert again, his betrayal taught me to value the relationships that truly matter, to nurture the connections that bring meaning to my life. There's a strange kind of gratitude I feel now, not for Robert's actions, but for the clarity they brought me. He showed me the dangers of blind ambition and the importance of balance. He forced me to look in the mirror and ask myself who I wanted to be. And as painful as it was, that reflection was the beginning of my journey towards something greater when the court ruling finally came. I sat in the back of the courtroom, my hands gripping the wooden bench as if it could keep me from falling apart. The judge's voice was steady, the words clear, yet they felt distant, like echoes in a vast, hollow room. I had lost, not completely. There was some restitution ordered, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to what Robert had taken. As the gavel struck, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel sadness. What I felt was emptiness, a void that swallowed everything I thought I was. For years, my identity had been intertwined with my wealth, my success, my position as a man at the top. Now, stripped of it all, I was left to ask myself a question I had avoided for too long. Who am I without it? The weeks that followed were a blur of packing boxes and selling off properties. The mansion I once called home was the first to go, its vast halls and sparkling chandeliers. Now just memories. I moved into a modest house, a far cry from the opulence I was used to, but it felt strangely comforting. The simplicity was soothing, a canvas on which I could start anew, but starting over wasn't easy. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision, every misstep, every moment. I ignored the warning signs. The weight of regret was suffocating, and for a while, it felt impossible to escape. Tobby became my anchor during those dark days. His unwavering loyalty and quiet presence reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. Each morning, we would set out on our walks, his energy pulling me out of bed when I wanted to stay buried in my misery. It was on one of those walks, as the first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, that a thought struck me with startling clarity. I couldn't change the past, but I could decide what to do with the time I had left. That realization was the first spark of hope I'd felt in months. It wasn't dramatic or life-altering in the moment, but it planted a seed slowly. I began to shift my focus from what I had lost to what I still had. I started small, making lists of things I was grateful for: the sound of birds in the morning, the feel of the sun on my skin, the wag of Tobby's tail when he saw me. I began to rebuild, not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate steps. My health, long neglected, became a priority. I traded the late nights and stress-induced meals of my past for fresh, simple foods and regular exercise. The walks with Tobby grew longer, and I added light jogging to our routine. But it wasn't just my body that needed healing. It was my mind. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto the pages in an effort to make sense of the chaos. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to confront my emotions without judgment. I also sought out mentors, people who had faced their own struggles and come out stronger on the other side. Their stories gave me perspective, reminding me that growth often comes from pain. One mentor, a former businessman who had reinvented himself as a teacher, shared a piece of advice that stayed with me. Success isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. Those words became a guiding principle as I rebuilt my life. I began volunteering at a local community center, teaching financial literacy to young adults. It was a humbling experience. Standing in front of a room full of eager faces, sharing lessons I had learned the hard way, but it also gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to get up each morning beyond just surviving. The process of rebuilding was slow and often painful. There were setbacks, moments when the shadows of my past threatened to overwhelm me. But each time I reminded myself of the vision I had for my future, a life built on balance, gratitude, and meaningful connections. As time passed, I found myself growing stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. The man I saw in the mirror was different from the one who had once stood in boardrooms and signed multi-million-dollar deals. He was quieter, humbler, but also more resilient. I began to understand that the true measure of wealth isn't the size of your bank account, but the quality of your relationships, the impact you have on others, and the peace you carry within yourself. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't known in years. Tobby lay at my feet, his soft snores a comforting soundtrack to the stillness. This is what I was chasing all along, I thought, not the money or the status, but this, the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with intention. Rebuilding my life didn't mean erasing the past. The scars of what I had been through remained, reminders of the lessons I had learned, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they became part of my story, a testament to my resilience and the choices that had brought me here. As I reflect now, I see the beauty in starting over. It's not about forgetting or pretending the pain didn't exist. It's about taking those experiences, however difficult, and using them to create something new. I still think about Robert sometimes, not with anger, but with a sense of clarity. His betrayal was a turning point, a catalyst that forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew. In a way, I'm grateful, not for what he did, but for the path it set me on. The road ahead is still uncertain, but I no longer fear it. I've learned to embrace the unknown, to find strength in vulnerability, and to trust that, with each step forward, I am building a legacy worth leaving behind. It had been years since I last saw my daughter, Sarah. The distance between us wasn't measured in miles, but in time and the wounds of my own making. I'd missed birthdays, milestones, even the birth of her first child, all because I was too consumed by the demands of my former life. So, when an elegant white envelope arrived in the mail with her name etched in gold on the front, my heart skipped a beat. Inside was an invitation to her wedding. No handwritten note, no personal message, just the formal details of the ceremony. The absence of her words stung, but I couldn't blame her. I had been absent from her life far longer than any note could mend. I held the invitation for days, turning it over in my hands, the weight of it heavier than anything I had ever carried. Should I go? Would she even want me there? The questions gnawed at me, but in the end, I knew I couldn't let fear hold me back. If this was a chance to reconcile, even slightly, I had to take it. When the day arrived, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my tie, my hands trembling. Tobby sat at my feet, his eyes watching me as if sensing my unease. "What do you think, boy?" I asked, smoothing down the lapel of my jacket. His tail wagged slightly, a gesture of encouragement that brought a small smile to my face. The venue was beautiful, a sprawling garden adorned with soft white flowers and fairy lights strung between the trees. Guests milled about, their laughter and conversation blending with the gentle strains of a string quartet. I felt out of place, a man walking into a world he no longer belonged to. And then I saw her. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her back turned to me as she spoke to someone. Her hair, the same shade as her mother's, cascaded down her shoulders, and for a moment, I was transported back in time to when she was a little girl, running through the halls of our home with boundless energy. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground, but before I could retreat, she turned and caught sight of me. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of surprise, hesitation, and something else I couldn't quite place. "Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying over the noise. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She excused herself from her conversation and approached me, her steps measured as if she were testing the waters of this fragile reunion. "You came," she said simply. "Of course," I managed, my voice cracking. "Thank you for inviting me." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched out painfully, filled with unspoken words. Finally, she broke it. "It's been a long time," she said, her tone neither accusatory nor forgiving. It has, I admitted, my gaze falling to the ground. And I know that's my fault. I stopped, unsure of how to condense years of regret into a single sentence. I've made mistakes. Sarah, too many to count. But I'm trying to be better. I want to be better. Her expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of the warmth I remembered from her childhood. I hope so, she said. That moment, brief as it was, felt like a lifeline. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. As the ceremony began, I found a seat near the back, not wanting to intrude on the family she had built without me. Watching her walk down the aisle, her face glowing with happiness, I felt a lump form in my throat. I had missed so much, but here she was, radiant and strong. I couldn't take credit for the woman she had become, but I could start being present for the life she was living now. After the ceremony, I lingered on the outskirts of the reception, unsure if I should stay or leave. That's when a small hand tugged at my sleeve. I turned to see a little boy with bright eyes staring up at me. "Are you Grandpa Jim?" he asked. His voice filled with curiosity. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. I guess I am, I said, my voice shaky. "I'm Ethan," he announced proudly. "Mom said you might come. Do you want to see my dinosaurs?" I couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking through the tension that had gripped me all day. "I'd love to," I said, letting him pull me toward a corner where his toys were scattered. As I sat on the grass with Ethan, listening to him excitedly name each dinosaur, I felt something I hadn't in years, hope for the first time. I saw a path forward. Not one where I could undo the past, but one where I could build something new. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Sarah found me again. She watched as I said goodbye to Ethan, who ran off with a gleeful shout, clutching his favorite dinosaur. "He likes you," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I like him too," I said. "He reminds me of you at that age." Her smile widened. And for a moment, the years of distance between us seemed to shrink. "I hope you'll come visit," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "We'd like to have you around." The lump returned to my throat, and I nodded, unable to trust my voice. As I drove home that night, Tobby resting peacefully in the passenger seat, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The road to reconciliation would be long, but for the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. As the morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, I sat at the wooden table, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hands. Tobby was at my feet, his tail lazily swaying with the contentment of a dog who knew he was home. It was a quiet life now, far removed from the chaos of boardrooms and endless deadlines, but it was a life I had come to cherish. I glanced at the leather-bound journal resting beside my coffee. Its pages were filled with thoughts, lessons and moments that had shaped the man I had become. Writing had become part of my daily routine, a practice of gratitude and reflection that anchored me to the present. Every morning I would take Tobby on a walk through the sprawling fields behind the house. Today was no different as we strolled along the familiar path, the dew-covered grass brushing against my boots. I thought about the winding road that had brought me here. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was one I had learned to love. After returning home, I opened my journal to a fresh page. The pen poised in my hand, I began writing. "Success isn't about what you leave behind in material wealth, but the lives you touch along the way." It was a sentiment I had come to understand deeply, especially in the years since my world had crumbled. Losing everything had stripped away the distractions and forced me to confront what truly mattered. It wasn't the luxury cars, the sprawling mansions, or the expensive suits. It was the relationships I had neglected, the moments of joy I had overlooked, and the chance to leave something meaningful for those who came after me. The memory of Sarah's wedding lingered in my mind. The shy smile she had given me as we said our goodbyes was etched into my heart. It was a start, a fragile bridge that I hoped to strengthen with time. And Ethan, his wide-eyed excitement as he showed me his dinosaurs, had awakened a part of me I thought I had lost. I closed the journal and picked up the phone. It had been a few weeks since the wedding, and I wanted to hear Sarah's voice again. The call was brief, but it ended with her inviting me to visit. My heart swelled at the invitation. a reminder that reconciliation wasn't just a dream, it was becoming a reality. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the garden I had started planting a year ago. Rows of vegetables and herbs thrived under the sun, a testament to patience and care. Gardening had become another outlet for me, a way to reconnect with the earth and find solace in the simplicity of nurturing life. Tobby trotted beside me as I tended to the plants, his nose occasionally sniffing at the soil. "You're not much of a gardener," I teased, scratching behind his ears. "But you're a great supervisor." As the day wore on, I found myself reflecting on the idea of legacy. For so long, I had equated legacy with success, with leaving behind something grand and enduring. But now, I saw it differently. Legacy wasn't about buildings or businesses. It was about the values you instilled in others, the lessons you passed on, and the love you shared. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch with Tobby by my side. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from the fields. I watched the stars begin to appear, their light piercing the darkness, and I felt a deep sense of peace. "Do you think I've done enough, Tobby?" I asked softly. His tail thumped against the wooden floor, his way of saying yes. I reached for my journal again, scribbling down one final thought for the day. Happiness isn't found in what you achieve, it's found in the moments you cherish. And true success isn't measured by wealth, but by the lives you've made better. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of completeness, as if the pieces of my life had finally come together. The mistakes I had made, the pain I had endured, and the lessons I had learned. They were all part of a journey that had led me to this moment. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a little inspiration. Today, your support means the world to me.